The following video is an account of my personal experience with learning to draw from my imagination. I have made this video with the intention of hopefully providing some valuable information to others and assisting them in their own pursuit of learning how to draw. For as long as I can remember, I've been drawing, although there were some years throughout my life where I maybe didn't draw as much as I should have because of, distractions, but I would always eventually find myself coming back to the desk, picking up the pencil and putting it to paper, and for the longest time I would draw from photographs. As a kid, it would be pictures of my favourite cartoons, characters from movies and games, and as I got older, I would still draw that stuff, except I'd do it a little bit better. My drawings would look more like what it was that I was setting out to draw, and back then, that's what drawing was to me. That's all I really knew. I would search for a perfect photograph, and my intention was to draw that photograph as accurately as possible. Now, this naturally led into the style of drawing commonly referred to as realistic drawing, and you've probably seen a lot of this artwork out there, maybe in some of my old videos. It gets a lot of appreciation and appeals to a wide audience. If it's done well, they appreciate the artist's ability to render something with such accuracy, and onlookers can often relate to the subject that has been drawn. It's a very commercial way of working. It definitely has its uses, and it's still a skill that takes a long time to learn. I would recreate all of these existing images in pencil, hoping that the final drawing would be that much closer to appearing like the image that I was working from. And like with anything you spend a lot of time doing, I eventually improved and got a lot better at it, to the point where it wasn't really a challenge anymore. Yeah, I mean, the end result was satisfying, but it was as expected. The process of creating these drawings was becoming more of a chore, a task on repeat. I was a technician, sometimes referred to as a printer, and then one day I realised that maybe this isn't drawing, this is more like rendering. Now, of course, I don't want to take any credit away from the artists that do this. I don't want to devalue any means of creating artwork. I'm simply talking from my personal experience. I had just gotten bored with that way of working. The challenge wasn't there anymore as it was when I started. I wanted to struggle with something and make progress. But more importantly, I wanted to create something that came from me, to put more of myself in what it was that I was creating. This realisation was followed by a few weeks of inactivity. I wanted to draw something, but what could I draw? How could I draw? It was a habit for me to pull up photos on screen and get to work, but that was something that I was trying to get away from. I spent a lot of time watching videos, reading drawing books and studying other artists who seemed to have this ability to generate amazing images, drawings that could only come from them, depicting things that would rarely be seen in real life, and that's what I wanted to do. I knew that somewhere within myself I had something that I wanted to get out on paper, but I needed to change course, click the reset button and admit to myself that I maybe didn't know as much about drawing as I thought I did. There were how to draw books that introduced me to aspects of drawing that I previously did not pay much attention to. Perspective, anatomy, those were two of what was commonly referred to as the drawing fundamentals, and these fundamentals were described as the basic skills required for successful drawing. They would create a foundation, act as a starting point for someone who is on this pursuit of learning how to draw. I finally had something to learn and to struggle with. Now, it was a slow, gradual transition. I didn't just jump right into drawing from my imagination. I would still continue to use photographs, but my drawings were not direct representations of them. Instead, I would gather a collection of images to use as reference. Sometimes I would manipulate a reference image, adding to the subject that I was drawing, challenging myself to think about what I was doing. Fortunately, I never really struggled to come up with ideas. I just had never been required to do anything with them. I was now creating drawings in which I was able to make decisions. If I didn't want to draw something or make the image appear in a certain way, I didn't have to. I was giving myself some freedom and finding a good balance between drawing elements from reference and drawing parts from memory. I found out a lot about myself from doing this. The years that I had spent drawing from photos, creating realistic drawings, wasn't for nothing. I had developed an eye for detail. I had become very confident and comfortable using the tools that I was drawing with, so I wasn't a complete beginner. I also found that I didn't really have much of an issue when it came to visualizing things. Things that I see outside of drawing were slowly becoming useful, and this could tie a relation to the idea of having a photographic memory. I did find that I would often be able to visualize something in my head. This isn't uncommon, but perhaps I was able to use it to my advantage. The hard part was taking that fuzzy image that existed in my head and illustrating it on paper. Eventually I discovered a more practical way of looking at a situation like this, and it was a term known to artists called your visual library, and this is described as a collection of reference materials stored in your head. Images of various things that you can easily visualize and call upon when drawing something. To increase and improve your visual library, you should firstly create a lot of studies of a certain subject from reference or from life. Through the process of creating these studies, pay attention to what it is you are drawing, how it comes together, and how whatever you are drawing works. Absorb as much information about what you are drawing as you can. The more you know, the more you can draw. Challenge yourself to draw the subject on different angles, and you will naturally become more familiar with it, and when it comes to drawing without any reference to work from, you will have a basic understanding of how it appears. You will be able to rely on your visual library, perhaps not to draw the subject exact, but to draw something that can be recognised, even manipulated and built upon. I personally found this to be the case when it came to drawing environments. A lot of my studies in architecture would feed into my drawings and proved to be useful. All of these new ideas and aspects surrounding drawing were revealing themselves, and I began to become more interested in getting better at it. I spent a lot of time drawing in perspective, realizing that simple shapes could be transformed into more complex forms. There was an underlying construction that had to come first. The rendering stage that followed was something that I was already familiar with due to my previous year's drawing. I began to develop a more concise process to creating artwork, applying methods and techniques that I would learn. I found that the most effective way for me to learn was to make an attempt at creating complete drawings which incorporated all of these different elements. Buildings and hard surface objects which required me to use perspective, people which required anatomy. Of course, all of these different fundamentals are combined into one to produce a good work of art, and what I was creating at this stage probably wouldn't be considered a successful work of art, but that didn't matter to me. Every drawing that I was creating was an exercise and a tool for learning. It was part of a process to eventually get to a point where I might be able to create and execute more successful drawings. I practiced the concept of project-based learning, meaning that instead of just creating small individual studies, I would set myself a task of creating what could be considered a final drawing and making an effort to include my studies within the process of producing those. This gave me more of a direction and a set task rather than just drawing small studies for the sake of studying. Now, it might be worth me stating that, like a lot of artists, I am self-taught. I was the creator and I was also the critic. I would often try and analyse my own drawings to see what I could do better the next time and make a note of it. Sometimes I would post my work online, but for a long time I didn't really feel confident with it. But that wasn't a problem because luckily I was able to acknowledge that I was learning and I didn't spend too long getting hung up on every mistake that I made or every drawing that I could have done better. I think that this transition from drawing realistic images to depending on my own imagination was such a challenge, to the point where it humbled me, and for good reason. I didn't have high expectations. I was just happy to have finally discovered a new love for drawing. And I also believe that because I was self-taught, it took me a lot longer to discover all of this, to realise that drawing from imagination is doable when you learn and apply yourself in the right way. And of course it is. I mean, I was just so unaware, with no direction, to the point that I just assumed that good drawing is this ability to look at something that exists, like a photograph or maybe from life, which is probably more beneficial, but then realistically recreate what is in front of you on paper. And I mean, it can just be that if that's what you want it to be, but it can also be so much more. We live in an age where there is so much diversity and information out there for us to benefit from. It's best to figure out what works for you, and that's what is most important, figuring out what works for you. In fact, figure out who you are. I think that's why I had this desire to draw from my imagination. I wanted to learn more about myself and see what I could create when I'm not depending on anything else but myself. What seems to happen is all of your interests, inspirations, and experiences outside of drawing seems to directly influence your work, meaning that in the end, the work that you produce is a product of you.